What is real?
It's all in his mind.
How do you define real?
Purely psychosomatic. That boy needs therapy.
Beethoven had his critics too.
This is your life.
But it still hurts.
Stop trying to control everything and just let go.
I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
You know, we're living in a society.
That boy needs therapy.
We all do.
You know what divine intervention is?
It's your kids, Marty.
What's really going to bake your noodle later on is...
They didn't stop to think they should.
What just happened here was a miracle.
We all wear masks, metaphorically speaking.
So what are you gonna do about it?
You gotta grow up.
But how?
You have to let it all go to free your mind.
I'm scared.
That's a problem for future Homer. Man, I don't envy that guy.
Hi all, it's Nick here and welcome back to the Shedding Skin podcast. And we're on episode 9 of Confessions of an Itchoholic here. We finally begin to round the corner of this sprawling narrative running the bend of the character arc of my hero's journey or something. I realised that, perhaps up until this point, that this podcast could be seen as, sort of a list of the grievances of my life. I really hope it doesn't come off like that. You know, the goal is to be interested in the story of, challenge and the forces that make us, and those big frame-breaking events that sort of change us. It's really easy to complain and to become cynical in this life, I reckon. Especially if we live with regret. But my genuine hope is that I'm not coming off as doing that here. But if you feel that I have, then the final 2 episodes are for you. Prepare for sickeningly earnest expressions of gratitude and wonder and personal awakening. As I've said on my Substack and elsewhere many times, I think our stories are really powerful and amazing and interesting. And we all have these great stories of change and growth, I guess, sort of everybody. And I certainly don't think that my story is special. It's unique and feels pretty bloody special to me, that's for sure. But all of these things I'm describing are pretty normal kind of human experiences. I've read a lot of memoirs over the last few years, and these are mainly by famous people. And it seems like these people have the same problems, reactions, and epiphanies as the rest of us commoners. So anyway, this episode is a little bit of a cracker. As I begin to find relief as a young father, long-term mental patterns are finally revealed for the shit that they are, and nervous system regulation, if not achieved, is at least attempted. We revisit the veneer, and we go again on some thoughts on the joys and sorrows of parenting. And finally, there is a language warning on this one. Apparently, it's not possible to speak of personal awakenings without dropping some F-bombs. So, let's fucking go. Episode 9. Growing Up Whilst Parenting. Music quote. I've been crawling on my belly, clearing out what could have been. I've been wallowing in my own confused and insecure delusions. For a piece to cross me over, or a word to guide me in. I want to feel the changes coming down. I want to know what I've been hiding in. My shadow. Change is coming through my shadow. My shadow's shedding skin. I've been picking my scabs again. End quote. From the song 46 and 2 by Tool, released in 1996 and sung by Maynard James Keenan. How was it that in my worst singular moment, when I thought I was going to die, when I was alone, scared, unable to breathe, that was the moment I let go and found a piece of the elusive internal freedom that had evaded me? What was it about going to the brink, being forced to accept my predicament, and facing more fully the sensations in my vulnerable body without the story of my mind to obfuscate and suppress and deny that led to my veneer being reduced? This is a surprisingly common human experience, and it's called an ego death. More on that later. The spark of knowledge I'd gained in my ego death hospital visit was something like this. There is a falseness to fear. It's a trickster. It's not only fear, but also terror. The terror at being alive. The terror of awareness, of future pain, of knowing you will die, of attempts to control. It looks to envelop you, cage you, hold you to your old ways. Yet it can be faced. You can more fully accept yourself. And in doing so, transformation can, and pretty reliably does, occur. As Joseph Conrad said, quote, facing it, always facing it, that's the way to get through, end quote. Acceptance of what is, no matter how hard, is always better than fearing its complexity and ignoring, avoiding, sitting in self-denial.
Not listening.
The other side of this existential coin, where terror lies, is awe, an openness to the magical mystery of the complexity of life. So what does a man who has self-medicated his entire life to escape, to hide, do when his self-medicating has turned against him, morphed to addiction, a failing crutch that can no longer hold his weight? Well, I turn to self-medication, of course. All of life, all our pursuits are in some ways like self-medicating to survive. We just use different medications. Work, sport, art, drugs, success, attention, sex, prayer, food, TV, technology, shopping, codependency. This time, I swap alcohol and pharmacopoeia with psychedelics. 1. Psychedelics. Psychedelics go by many names. The word psychedelic means mind-revealing. They are called drugs, they are called plant medicines, they are called entheogens and hallucinogens. However you want to label them, like these psychoactive substances can be consumed to produce a physical and mental reaction, a trip, a journey into an altered state of consciousness. These molecules, including LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, peyote, and others, are all Schedule 9 prohibited substances in Australia. Well, that was true when I wrote this, but MDMA and psilocybin have been rescheduled pretty recently and can now be offered as part of therapy for people with PTSD and treatment-resistant depression. Maybe more on that later because it's a little bit complicated. So, for all intents and purposes, they are illegal. You cannot make them, grow them, consume them, without some sort of fear of legal ramifications. So, when I found myself sitting in a circle of strangers in the mountains of northern New South Wales, staring into a cup of green, lumpy cactus juice that I was about to swallow, I was very much taking my health into my own hands while shunning the medical and legal authorities. Fortunately, I wasn't really worried about this anti-establishment element, nor about taking my health choices off grid, because this is something I had been doing destructively for years. All the alcohol, all the tablets, all the pain meds, all the steroids, all the shit food and sugar. So surely doing something in the name of healing, however off grid, was a much easier thing to accept for my brain. And to be fair, I had spent countless months reading all the books, watching all the shows, talking to people and researching these substances. Just like my 1990s magic mushroom research from those fluorescent dial-up internet websites. As written previously, I had taken psychedelics before a few times, but never with any intent other than to get high. Like many people in 2018, I read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, The New Science of Psychedelics, which was a bit of a cultural zenith for the mainstreaming of psychedelics for healing. I had microdose weekly for nearly a year, which is a practice where you consume a small amount of psychedelic, not enough to even feel the effects, but enough to open your mind to more creative thought and disrupt your regular patterns of thinking. Sitting with modern-day shamans in idyllic and remote settings and consuming plant medicines for healing was having a bit of a cultural moment. So there were plenty of podcasts and written content, all of which I absorbed. Yet, as I stared down into this foreboding brew, I was pretty terrified. Any familiarity or confidence I may have gained in my research about the power of these substances evaporated. What was I about to do to myself by consuming this petrifying Peruvian cactus concoction, traditionally called wachuma or San Pedro for the colonizers, the psychoactive ingredient being mescaline? Who would I be on the other side of this weekend? What was I doing here? I knew I would be facing myself somehow, but other than my hospital ego death event experience, I didn't really know what that meant. I recall the heavy sensation of the weight of my troubles.
What do you mean isolated? Hated.
The predicaments that had spurred me to be here in this moment, sort of bearing down on me. My desire to be a better father, my desire to heal my addictions, the overwhelming need to escape from the circular health issues I was trapped in, wrapped in, the exhausting cycle of chronic illness, the lack of agency I felt like in my own life, a bit of a slave to my old patterns of thinking, and the agonizing cycles of my munted body. Remember, the itch and the scratch, the obsession and the compulsion, the pain and the short-term escapist relief, over and over again. I wore these burdens like a technicolor dream coat of shame, like an all-encompassing carapace of scarred skin, inflexible, restricting, and suppressing. So I drank, and I faced myself, and I shed. 2. Shedding. It still feels a bit taboo to talk about psychedelics. But anyway, here we go. So my experiences on that weekend and subsequent weekends were not what I expected prior to sitting with these medicines. Expectations being the way our minds attempt to often erroneously control the future. The experience of being under the influence of the medicine is, of course, its own thing. It can be intense, it can be a struggle at times. You can feel euphoria and have insights, and you can reflect on the wonder of all things and see some of the patterns occurring in your life and feel an expanded sense of love for those close to you. So it can be ecstatic. It's not a word that I'm particularly fond of, but you get the idea. Also, it can just be a dreamy, floaty bit of not much. You're pretty out of it, often lying down, one part of you half awake in the real world, one half asleep straddling mythical dreamscapes. Time warps. It can be a whirlwind with moments of great pleasure. In my case, being under the influence of psychedelics is often physically uncomfortable.
You took too much, man. You took too much.
My body reacts to these substances in a similar way that it reacts to most things, with suspicion and inflammation. Seems like many stories of taking psychedelics get caught up in what happens whilst the medicine is still active in your body.
There is no way of explaining the terrors I felt.
I.e., whilst you are still under the influence.
Okay, be quiet, be calm.
I.e., what it is like to be high and tripping.
Ignore this terrible drug.
But I'm not really interested in that, other than to explain the lifting of that burden of being, of whatever weight I was carrying in those moments, felt immensely relieving. Everything just is. I was having an experience that was not really passed through the usual affirming filters of my personality, my ego. Much like dying in a hospital bed. It's not easy to describe the relief garnered to a brain that was always struggling to know how to be, or to avoid how not to be, when it suddenly just, is existing in this moment of perfect complexity. It's the state that I tried to get to with alcohol so often, without understanding that alcohol doesn't allow you to stay present. It pushes you down. So when I consumed Wachuma, had my journey, went to sleep, and woke up the next day, that is when the real changes began to happen. I had reformatted my brain like a hard drive. I had wiped the cassette tape clean. I'd rewritten my CDRW compact disc. I'd set up my VCR brain ready to take the freshly incoming Simpsons episode of existence. How many more data storage metaphors can I come up with? And what the hell do they mean? Basically, things had changed. Scrap that. I had changed. Well, not really. I noticed some of the following. I didn't feel like I had gained any new information from the experience per se. It's paradoxically the opposite. It was more like I had diminished or lost completely, did I mention shed, parts of myself that were holding me back or standing in my way. To paraphrase an advertisement I must have seen over 100 times in the 90s,
it's the
part that Nick Gilpin
projects that makes
Nick Gilpin
the best.
I felt more like myself than normal, than I ever had, a deeper, calmer me. Like the me that rolled back to Brisbane after travelling Australia for a year. Only more. Hey, how is this possible? I was always me, wasn't I? How could I be more me? Any of the positive things that I felt I had gained, like expanded love for my wife and child, or a full acceptance of the complexity of humanity, seemed to have been inside me already. It became easier to accept things as they are, rather than applying some sort of judgment or filter to them. Whatever was happening was happening. For example, I climbed Mount Coolum and saw a rainbow piercing the sky. landing straight down into the waves of the endless ocean, and I was simply just like a witness to its beauty. The things that I found easier to accept could occur in the outside world, like someone pushes in front of me in a line and I just smile, and could also occur in the inside world. I notice a self-negative thought and then gently let it slide out of my head, saying goodbye.
Thank you, come again.
The judgments that usually came from the egoic part of my mind seemed to have been reduced. I did notice nature a lot more, my own nature and the rhythms of my body, which was a new thing for me, and also the beauty of the nature that was all around me that I normally didn't notice as much because I was too busy or in my head. My well-worn, unthinking, often compulsive patterns of thought and behaviour became gradually illuminated to me. It turns out what I hid from the world over my long life of concealment, I hid from myself. Yet these self-eluding structures could hide no longer. Without getting too much into the neuroscience, psychedelics seem to have a reducing effect on our, quote, default mode network, end quote. A part of the brain that acts as a sort of conductor, alternatively suppressing and allowing certain brain regions to communicate with each other. When this default mode network is dialed down, brain activity doesn't increase, but connectivity between areas of the brain increases. Previously unavailable neural pathways can be forged anew, as if your brain has been through a bit of a reboot, cleared out a bunch of old cache and corrupted databases, and is bootstrapping again while seeing the world with fresh eyes and increased openness. In some ways, you are briefly returning to a more childlike state, like the veneerless toddler, seeing the wonder and awe in the world as you once did before your mind built the mechanisms for survival that ultimately close you off to some of these experiences. This is exactly why people drink alcohol. It gives them permission to act young, to be childlike, and to act up and be silly and laugh and not act their age. Like, who wants to act their age? In his book, This Is Your Mind on Plants, Michael Pollan shares his thoughts on taking mescaline. He notes that, quote, natural selection has shaped human consciousness, not necessarily to scrupulously represent reality, but to maximize survival, admitting only a measly trickle of information needed to get by, but that something very different happens in the brain on mescaline, and that the bottom-up information of the senses and the emotions inundates our awareness, sweeping away the mind's predictions, maps, beliefs, in what feels like a tidal wave of awe, end quote. So many people have taken psychedelics and changed their lives, me being just one. Of course, many people have taken them and not much has changed too. It turns out that the way that you take them, the infamous set and setting, i.e. the environment you consume them in and your mindset and intention at the time, is pretty important too.
Jesus, God almighty, look at that bunch over there, man. They've spotted us.
But more than anything, it depends on who you are and what is happening in your head at the time. There is an oft lampooned impulse for people who take psychedelics to overshare their experiences, shout about them from endless podcasts and the pages of Substack newsletters, bang on and on about the healing and how you have got to try this. Oh dear. Fortunately, I, your podcast host, generally suffer from crippling self-doubt after a lifetime of shame. So I won't be recommending that a new utopia on Earth can be reached by all of us getting high and loving each other and putting flowers in our hair, as nice as those things would be. I have seen some of the dark side of taking psychedelics. They can amplify what already exists in people's minds to negative ends. They have been called, quote, non-specific amplifiers, end quote. And they can impart a sense of unnecessary grandiosity and individualism. If you are sort of blank slating your mind and rebuilding your inner self from scratch with very intense ego-destroying drug experiences, you can become vulnerable to the many extremely bad ideas that are floating out there in the world. For example, there seems to be a correlation between people who have taken a lot of psychedelics and a belief in pseudoscience and conspiracy theories as they relate to New Age spirituality. Anyway, so it's with caution and a sense of humbleness that I speak to how much my life has been drastically changed by these substances. The gigantic leaps in my own personhood happened when I started to see more deeply the patterns of decision-making and internal thinking that had been the dominant story in my head.
I reckon that John West shooting black's getting picky.
Such as the illumination of my addictive and compulsive behaviours and my dysfunctional relationship with my own body. After days or even weeks post-journey, many of these restrictive internal dialogues began to recede and fall away, and I started to act out new sets of patterns and habits and rituals that came from like a deeper consciousness about how I wanted to be and how I should honor and care for myself. I use the word honor here because that word more than any other explains how I began to think about myself in opposition to what would be the opposite of honor, which would be dishonor. 3. Revelations. The reason that for my entire life I was unable to care for my body the way that it really needed, because as a coping mechanism for the suffering my body wrought upon me, I disassociated from it a bit and treated it like an other. It had to be an other because it would be too painful if it wasn't, if it was just me. I always wished it away and I always wanted it to be different. I couldn't accept anything close to the truth about it. This is too painful. The mental separation caused treating my body like shit to be completely normalized. Simply a way of coping with the burden of having a calamitous and inflamed physical meat bag to wobble around in. Now, these revelations are so obvious and so simple and are things that I had intuited over the years. But the complete understanding of the reveal requires the person whose mind is deceiving themselves to heal enough to feel the truth. One of the paradoxes of understanding seems to be that you can be told things like facts or truth, even think about them yourself, and still not absorb what they actually mean. It's when you feel them like a revelation, like an embodied understanding, that they really affect you and you fully receive the news that you've been actively ignoring. Of course, counter to that, it's completely possible to feel things that are not factually true, another mental landmine. In her book, Listening to Ayahuasca, ayahuasca being a type of plant medicine sort of similar to Wachuma, Rachel Harris, PhD, gathers many reports of people's experience of their life after consuming this plant, noting that, quote, people describe being more aware of their bodies and their energy levels, along with a greater desire to take care of themselves, end quote. So Mescaline quickly revealed to me that I had been hiding from myself a pretty big set of programming that kept me in a cycle of suffering. My body felt sick or was in pain, physical suffering. This caused substantial mental anguish. I didn't have any positive framework to hold these sensations. I had no mechanism to go on the dropped ice cream upset roller coaster because I was constantly dropping the fucking ice cream because it was riddled with nuts and the roller coaster was constantly making me deathly nauseous. My coping mechanism for this suffering was to create compulsions and reach for the self-gratification of all of my addictions. These addictions would contribute to making my body feel sick. The merry-go-round would continue. It's so fucking obvious. I knew this cycle intimately on a subconscious level, but up on the conscious level, I would exist in just great shame every time I got sick, knowing that I wasn't doing everything I could to care for my body. I knew that I was contributing to my body's ill health on some level, just enough to make me feel deeply shit about it. But I didn't know how to break out of that frame and accept the truth of my compulsions and addictions. Psychedelics helped strip away this self-deception, revealing to me that I never really learned how to look after myself because I was constantly reacting. I couldn't see clearly through my own mind's defense, my veneer, my own personal umwelt, a mechanism that had built me up to survive in the world and to interact in the social realm, but to do so by pretending I was something that I was not. My disastrous paranoid experience in my early 20s.
What the hell are you talking about?
Remember episode 6. Was the parts of my mind unsuccessfully trying to reconcile this split. It was staggering to me that I could exist for so long without knowing that my body really, really needed me to care for it. And more than an average person too. Like, who knew I needed to love myself? I spent weeks, like months even, just like flabbergasted that I had existed for so long, where everything in regard to my body revolved around some sort of dysfunction. Sugar, drugs, alcohol, junk food, sleep routines, exercise, you name it, I was hiding from it. Like, I genuinely am not being hard on myself about this. It was just objectively true that I didn't look after myself. The power of the patterns of addiction and reaction and dislocation was so strong, they suppressed this humongous truth from me. Yet here I was, finally, becoming uncaged, untamed, sumo-slapped into waking up to my delusions. 4. Booze again.
Will there be beer?
Have you ever woken up, cursed to the high heavens, your deathly, nauseating hangover?
Beer is not allowed.
Swore never to touch the hideous devil's juice again.
Home or no function, beer well without.
And by the afternoon you think, I could go a fresh cold one.
Would you rather have beer or complete and utter contentment?
What kind of beer?
That, my friends, is the alcohol roller coaster ride. Yes, I have overused the roller coaster metaphor in this podcast, but too bad. It's the best way to explain what life is. The modulating of your dopamine and endorphin systems, the elasticity of your ever-springing back nervous system from suppression to withdrawal, to the lure of suppression again. Hangover is simply a more socially acceptable word for withdrawal. I had tried many times to reduce or quit completely my love affair with Lady Liquor after 2 decades of riding the booze roller coaster. Michael Pollan tells the story of Bill Wilson, an alcoholic living in New York in the 1930s, who, quote, credited his own sobriety to a mystical experience he had on belladonna, a plant-derived alkaloid with hallucinogenic properties that was administered to him at Towns Hospital in Manhattan in 1934. End quote. Bill went on to be the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, the sobriety program that would be championed by my Uncle Jimmy in Sydney in the 80s and 90s. I have no idea if my uncle knew that a cornerstone of Alcoholics Anonymous, the, quote, surrendering to a higher power, end quote, can be traced back to Bill's semi-psychedelic drug trip. Once I had consumed Uchumo, my attraction to alcohol pretty much vanished almost overnight. The strangest thing was I didn't have to quit. You see, quitting requires energy, force, planning. It's like a battle. You must summon inhuman and often unsustainable amounts of energy to keep reminding yourself of what you are trying to achieve, i.e. not drinking tonight. You also need to tell people about it, compelled to externally justify something that you are struggling to justify internally. I'm off the booze until Christmas holidays. I'm doing dry July. I'm just taking a break. But just like dieting without facing the reasons that you comfort eat, you'll most likely put the weight back on when the effort to sustain the diet subsides. If there is a deeper reason that you drink too much and you can't figure out what that is, the addiction will most likely remain. I was able to previously quit alcohol for weeks at a time this way, months even, fooling myself that I wasn't under some spell. But it would never really last, and like a scoundrel, I would eventually wake in an anxiety-riddled, dehydrated, hungover mess of a state. My digestive system exploded after capitulating to its power over me once more. Some further research from Rachel Harris in regards to psychedelic users' ability to face their addictions. Quote, changes were not the result of willpower or discipline. Rather, they seem to unfold spontaneously, as if based on some kind of revelation. Others came out of ceremony and changed lifelong patterns with seemingly no effort, end quote. And that rather than being the result of, quote, white-knuckle self-control, end quote, many people reported their destructive patterns, obsessions, and addictions were healed by, quote, an internal shift that seems to happen organically, end quote. So alcohol was no longer a part of the ritualistic component of my life. Whatever patterns that existed in my mind that drew me to modulate myself with booze, patterns perhaps passed down through the generations, had been rerouted. Ways of relating to the world, thought patterns, habits, and rituals are all codified in our minds over time. And my mind had just been through a big cleanse, and all the rituals and habits were now up for grabs. Suddenly, I was able to advocate for myself over a much longer time frame. opting to prioritize my long-term physical well-being in ways that were hitherto not available to me. This included illuminations about my sleep habits, nutrition, exercise, my dental health, and being much more responsible with my medicines. All quite sensible things that perhaps most normal people are aware of. But for me, once I was able to face them calmly and with fresh eyes, they greatly improved the quality of my life. Bessel van der Kolk again, quote, "Self-regulation depends on having a friendly relationship with your body. Without it, you have to rely on external regulation from medication, drugs, alcohol, constant reassurance, or compulsive compliance with the wishes of others." End quote. 5. Alternate therapies. Once I was awoken, in a sense, to my own mindfuckery, patent pending, I was able to explore more options for wellness and techniques for better managing my body, including alternate therapies like breathwork, meditation, nature immersions, and cold plunges, amongst other things. For me, these techniques are great, but they didn't and don't really solve any of my health problems directly. They offer me a less destructive way to regulate my inflamed carcass of a nervous system, to soothe it, manage it, coddle it, cuddle it even. They are pleasantly antithetical to alcohol and sleeping tablets and getting shouty at my children. But there is a potential downside to alternative therapies. In her book, The Gospel of Wellness, Rena Raphael outlines how wellness has become like a religion. Everyone is drinking kombucha and cooking bone broth and downward dogging their way to enlightenment. But it is often a commodification and commercialization of our inherent desire to have some control over our fates, often fueled unhelpfully by social media. The cleanses and the diets and the gym memberships and the Instagram aspirational quotes are an attempt to purify us of the toxicity of our modern lives. But so much of this so-called toxicity is conflated with the norms of modern living, which offer us untold and often unseen benefits that are rarely appreciated. Once again, it's the certainty that rubs me the wrong way. This painfully strict regimen of self-care will provide you with the salvation you desire. Just purchase these supplements. Often the rituals and supplements and ways of life offered by the wellness industry appear just another way we hold on so tight to our definitive knowing. Like, this product will make me feel the way that I ought to, in the face of an ultimately complex and unpredictable world that can be challenging to navigate. Like, we want to know what we can do to make things all right. And there are plenty of people willing to sell us the answer. That desire for wellness can become as obsessive as the calamitous coping mechanisms of addiction to survive that I deployed for quite a lot of my life. So swapping a veneer of disassociation from the truth of the complexity of life with the veneer of the futility of obsessing over controlling for that complexity. So it's important to me to remember that I'm not looking for perfection, because it doesn't exist. My imperfect body and my loopy mind remind me of that daily, but a previous version of myself could only lust after a different me, a level of perfection that I saw on TV and magazines and in my mind's eye. Quote, "I want a perfect body, I want a perfect soul," end quote. Tom York wistfully laments in Creep. These are the things we desire, but none of us have. As Rena says, quote, "Unattainability is the leading tenet of perfection. More than anything, perfectionism says a lot about what we crave. It is, at the end of the day, an anxious need for control over our lives," end quote. So I have to remember the goal is self-acceptance with a sprinkling of self-exploration, not self-mastery or self-dominance, as these things are not possible. Music quote, "I'm sowing the seeds. I'm sowing the seeds I've taken. I'm sowing the seeds I take for granted. This thorn in my side, it's from the tree. This thorn in my side, it's from the tree I planted. It tears me and I bleed. I'm digging my way to something better." From the song Bleeding Me by Metallica, released in 1996 and sung by James Hetfield. 6. Parenting and reparenting. Surely I couldn't be the only one that needed to wake up to myself, whatever that means. Could I? It turns out I wasn't even the only one who needed to wake up to themselves in my own family. My wife Kate had to go through an intense period of suffering, collapse, and stress for the first few years of being a mother, before her own long history of anxiety and OCD was revealed to her so she could begin to understand it and let it go. The immense pressure she felt to be a certain way as a mother was in part a catalyst for her to begin understanding that so much of her life was mediated between her desire to live authentically and her constantly arriving, obsessive self-talk that she was insufficient. So, we found ourselves summoning the most monumental and gargantuan effort to grow up whilst right in the middle of raising other people, and a global pandemic, no less. And much research has confirmed that the child-raising years are, quote, less happy, end quote, for many, many parents. So this hardship is real and pretty quantifiable. But for us, both the need to become more aware of our own foibles and neuroses was catalyzed by the arrival of our children, because we realized we were not able to act the way that we wanted as parents because we hadn't yet sorted our shit out. So what is a meaningful life, and can I create that for my children? The reason I find myself asking that question is because through my actions as a parent, I am directly answering it, whether I'm consciously asking myself the question or not. What I am being, my patterns, habits, rituals, addictions, reactions, my ways of coping, is what I am passing to them. The life I am building for my kids arises out of how I am towards them and what I do, the patterns of my actions and my reactions. So the next question that immediately arises from that original question, do I have a meaningful life for myself? Oh, what a terrifying question. Fuck me. What am I doing? One thing I am definitely doing is passing on whatever the fuck I am doing to my kids, whether I know what I'm doing or not. So I must be learning life, exploring life, playing with life, being curious in order to teach it. Else I am teaching like a rigid, immovable, preconceived, unexplored way of being through the unseen patterns and reactions and compulsions in my head. Can I create meaning for my kids that I cannot create inside myself and for my own life? I don't think so. Else I risk the forcing of an inauthenticity onto my children that I felt for so much of my childhood. The trap is thinking that I can hammer the square peg of certainty, control, and rigidity into the round hole of complexity, meaning, and purpose. A better way, the only way, is to be attempting to figure out these things for yourself, then, quote, show them how to live, end quote, by being that process of attempting. And even better, be curious with them, share with them, and include them in the attempting. Like I can't hide my struggles from my own children. As Alana sang in 95, quote, no one's really got it all figured out just yet, end quote. All of this is helpfully laid out in Harry Chapin's song, Cats in the Cradle. A dad has a son and wants a better life for him, but misses his childhood by being busy. When the dad is old, he wants to connect with his son, realizes his son has grown up just like him because all his son ever wanted was to be like his dad. That is someone too busy to connect. I reckon that where disconnection between parent and child exists, it's a projection of the disconnection inside the parent with themselves. Like my grandfather's anger, alcoholism, and violence was a reflection of his deeply held dislike of himself, his self-shame. In lieu of his inability to process these things within himself, he could only unconsciously spread it outwards into the lives and nervous systems of my mum and her siblings. My grandmother's strictness, fundamental thinking, and desire for control arose out of her feelings of inadequacy and a fear of not being accepted and of having to be seen a certain way, that futile attempt to control what others think of us. And this emerged as an uncaring strictness, emotional disconnection, addiction, and a need to control my dad and his brothers. Some of these traits were passed to my parents and then passed to me. Hey, we're all someone's daughter. We're all someone's son. Thanks, Johnny Farnham. In our worst moments as parents, when we lose it at our kids and turn into snarling, judgmental beasts, we treat our children the way we often treat like our deepest, selves. You know that part of you that is very critical of yourself, super judgmental, even cynical to the point of self-hatred? You may not have that, or you may just have to look super deep for it. That part, like left unseen and unexplored, is the part of you that you won't be able to prevent from leaking out and onto your family members, which is often harshly, like with judgment, criticism, oftentimes without the mega amounts of love that they deserve. These are, after all, the people that you love most, but therefore, of course, they get the worst of you. The irony of the situation is that if, say, you react with anger towards your children, in order for them to maintain the necessary attachment to us as their loving carers and guides in this world, they deflect their hurt and frustration away from us and angle it towards themselves. The children will instinctively make themselves feel unlovable, as if a personal failing of theirs, rather than to see their parents as unloving towards them. In his book, When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress, Gabor Mate says, quote, "Not infrequently, anger is redirected from an attachment figure who aroused it and is aimed instead at the self. Inappropriate self-criticism results." Of course, all this happens in degrees over many changeable situations and life stages. It's not an all or nothing binary. Our children don't really know what's true about themselves as opposed to what's true about their parents, because they haven't separated enough from us yet, and they haven't matured the self-awareness faculties that can allow personal reflection. So the lesson for me here is that parenting really is about self-regulation. Can I keep my cool inside my own fucked nervous system whilst trying to regulate those external and yet to fully develop nervous systems? It's a massive challenge. Like, I want to teach my kids that in order to become good at something, or even better, master it, first, they have to be crap at it. Like really crap, almost useless. Tolerating our own crapness is essential. Otherwise, we feel shit about ourselves all the time and never feel any sort of momentum. The problem with being a kid is they are crap at so many things, said with love. You take them to the beach and they do their best to drown themselves, get stung by jellyfish, or get fried to a crisp in the deathly hot sun, only because they haven't learned how to best be in the world yet. They haven't really mastered anything, let alone life. Does anyone ever? When it comes to the parent, because the kids are novices at everything, they require our expertise, like constantly. It is exhausting. They require our expertise to primarily keep them from dying and then to be the best people they can be. The first only marginally easier to achieve than the second. With the relentless need to manage and corral and administer, the parent runs out of the ability to self-regulate, if they had it to begin with. Superhuman strength is required to regulate your own nervous system and those of the little people around you, who seem completely happy to smear raspberries on the absorbent fabric couch cushions, or piss on the living room rug whilst laughing maniacally, or barrel into the ocean with no regard for rips and sets of waves coming to annihilate them. The question then becomes, can I, the wise parent, keep my cool, self-regulate, calmly navigate my children through time, and not need to reach for the wine bottle or whiskey glass once they are finally asleep just to cope? If you can get through some of this as the years roll past, one of the greatest gifts is bearing witness to when your children do reach some sort of mastery in something, when their skills in something impress and even surpass your own. Oh man, that is the gold. 7. Powerlessness and Control. Addictions arise out of a sense of powerlessness, and the addictive habit is the way that we control for that. For me, obviously, it was feeling powerless to prevent my body from becoming ensickened, which isn't a real word, but I'm coining it, ensickened. An addict can easily be shamed for lack of discipline, yet a more nuanced understanding of an addict's behaviour would show multiple factors at play, from disconnection from self and others to past trauma and learned negative patterns, to the avoidance of current pain and suffering with old, unhelpful coping tools, plus the temptations of powerfully addictive activities and drugs that are easy to reach for. I find solace in the knowledge that I'm not alone at feeling like, if not powerless, at least like at the mercy of huge forces at play in the world. Like we're all living, albeit unequally, through loss and death, isolation, alienation, FOMO, discrimination, and the ever-looming spectre of our own mortality. Our own very human responses to the tectonic plates that we find ourselves walking upon are to strut and fret our way through each moment, holding tight to our specific compulsions and obsessions as the control that we feel we need in order to walk straight and not fall. But part of the solution for me is to attempt to hold the larger complexity of human suffering and sickness, i.e. it affects us all and it all leads us to the same place.
How's your mother?
Oh, she's on her way out.
You all are. Act accordingly.
Death. I know this is very existential, but life is not fair. Like my amazing, incredible, talented, and big-hearted friend Scott died in the snow in Japan, and I want to know why. But there is no answer that can justify the immensity of a loss like that. People regularly get sick and die, and we want to know why. And then I get sick, and I want to know why, to find an answer to that constantly salient question. Like, why do I feel so shit? The question means that I avoid the reality that I am sick, as hard as it is, and that is my burden in that moment. The question could be reframed as, how am I going to shoulder the burden of this sickness right now? Am I able to not beat myself up mentally about this? Am I able to not pass on my frustrations onto those around me? Am I able to not feel less than, but to accept what is? I think for the majority of my life, I was unable to take responsibility for how I felt. Not that I was the cause of it or to blame for it, just that it was real and happening. Without first accepting that it was happening and not hiding from it, I was unable to hold myself softly and instead created predatory thinking about my value as a person. There's an old adage that I completely made up that posits that if you absolutely must shit in a spa, shit in your own spa, not someone else's. At the very least, I was considerate in that sense. I'm thankful that over my life, I've never really shat in other people's spas. If I have, I apologise and I'm happy to offer you filter cleaning reparations. But for so long, I was a seasoned expert at shitting in my own.